Hi, this is Kurt Doolittle from the Proprietarian Institute of Natural Law. I'm here with Dr. Brad once again. This is the first principles of psychology, and in the first principle of psychology is going to be acquisition. We start out with acquisition, the origin of all our motivations. As in the previous section on human faculties, we talked about the biological origin of incentives and how it's really just three chemicals that tell us what to do. But this results in a very simple algorithm, is that the purpose of all our behavior is to acquire, and that all behavior is reducible to the incentive to acquire interests. It's a large variety of interests because we can make use of a wide variety of resources. But all behavior is describable as I want this. and that's because man's time is limited and the only ultimate scarcity. In other words, the resource we're continuously spending, which we think of as energy, is regulated by time. In other words, we're always trying to save time. This is more useful than saying we're always trying to obtain energy, for a variety of reasons I'll cover later on. Man is a costly life form and in an unpredictable universe. And so we have to acquire resources to live within this unpredictable universe. And we must act or move to acquire and inventory resources. As we must remember, in order to decrease the cost to acquire and inventory those resources. And we have to defend that which we've acquired and inventoried. And so we do. This is the basis of all our behavior, just like very primitive animals defend themselves, their nests, and their offspring, and their hunting grounds or their food grounds. We tend to defend pretty much everything we have an interest in acquiring. And we have to reproduce, if at all possible, and cooperate to obtain sufficient resources across our lifespan. So the value of cooperation is disproportionate to any other action we can take, which is why we're so heavily biased to cooperate at almost all times, because we're so expensive a life form, and we have this interesting trade-off between caloric consumption and an inability to make use of cheap calories. We need expensive calories like meats. And we don't have the ability to store energy or carry it with us like a lot of other animals do. So we've made a trade-off of the possibility for starvation in order to increase the rate of caloric consumption. Of course, that's why we ate everything on the planet in a few thousand years. So again, man is a expensive life form, but the reason is our hyper adaptability is due to having this brain. The thing is, the brain's really expensive. It's 11 times as expensive as equivalent muscle. So one of the reasons we need to sleep and rest and whatever is not only to clean up the waste products up there, not only to make sure that we can rehearsively retain memories we've made over the past day, but because it's an expensive organ that keeps running all the time. Even if we're not thinking, even when we're sleeping, the organ is running. It's just not running as hot as it can when we're thinking hard or under stress. So the brain, or intelligence in the brain, provides the fastest means of a life form's adaptation. Neoteny, conscientiousness, and intelligence are the direction of increased adaptation in man. In other words, our ability to make use of time, what we consider intelligence, the ability to make use of time by adapting more rapidly, is an incredibly expensive but incredibly effective use of energy. So our man's drive is to acquire. What we acquire is all sorts of things. We have to acquire an inventory of resources because we can starve easily. We have to produce the greatest returns in the shortest time with the least effort, with the greatest certainty at the lowest risk, in competition with the alternatives that we can save, use, consume, transport, or trade. is why most economics was relatively primitive at the beginning, and why I pick on libertarians for their Misesian nonsense, because the competition that we're under in continuous time is not always operating at the optimums of what a trader is looking for in commodities. So this is a demonstrated behavior. In other words, this isn't a theory. This is what people do, and it's what people do because of the physical necessity of doing those things. So we have to make use of time. And this demonstrated behavior is rational. In other words, we can experience it in our lives. It's logical. We can comprehend the necessity of it. It's empirical. We can observe it universally. And it's a physical necessity of the natural world bound by the laws of the physical universe. So our necessity of acquisition, our primary function of acquisition, our reduction of all behavior to descriptions of acquisition, well, this is just a continuation of the laws of the universe, physical laws of the universe. So all human behavior can be described commensurably as needs, motivations, and incentives to acquire, maintain, and not lose. But what's rational? We use the word rational, we mean rational choice. So what's a rational choice? And so I'm going to disambiguate that as comprehensible, reasonable, rational, logical, calculable, and computable. So given the need to require those resources that we just went over, greatest return, shortest time, least cost, lowest risk of failure, lowest risk to yourself, the greatest with the least chance of rivalry or retaliation from others, with the greatest degree of certainty and momentary competition with all other wants and opportunities, given present knowledge and resources, given our homeostatic stasis that persists over the window of decision time before action. So, that's the algorithm for human behavior. All human beings, whether we're aware, conscious, and of agency, seek to acquire, consume, and hold and defend our demonstrated interests. And those demonstrated interests consist of three categories: natural, obtained, and common, or what we call commons. So these are the demonstrated interests, or what humans consider their balance sheet. We're incredibly effective at. It's amazing how good we are at accounting for our demonstrated interests. Our existential interests or our natural interests are in ourself, our life, our body, our genes, our memories, our mind, our attention, our time. And as time, there with our existential interests or natural interests are the ability to act, to obtain stimulation, and to gain experience. And because cooperation is so important, we manage status, class, reputation, and honor, our self-image, our reputation in social, sexual, economic, political, and military markets. We maintain that as almost more desperately than any other physical inventory. And this is interesting because a lot of what we're see be human behavior is actually status and self-image protection, because status is your ability to gain resources through the cooperation with others, because status does provide discounts on cooperation. And your self-image is necessary to preserve the will to act under constantly adversarial circumstances. So these are necessary functions for you to be able to survive. That's why it's strange, but we protect our self-image and status almost at all costs. Obviously, we have offspring, mates, kin, and kith, and these are interpersonal relationship interests. And we have sustainable patterns of cooperation and association, like insurance, reproduction, production, distribution, and trade, friends, acquaintances, neighbors, cooperative relations, commercial relations, political and military relations. These are all interests that we seek to acquire and hold. And because what almost all of those things do is they provide discounts on the cost of obtaining more acquisitions. Well, once we have these natural or bodily or associative interests, there are other interests we want to obtain, where an obtain interest refers to interests that are obtained by bearing a cost of an opportunity. In other words, all costs are opportunity costs, time cost, an effort cost, a resource cost, a status cost, a relationship cost, association cost. When there's any cost we've got to bear, it's important because there's this error in economics and social science, and actually on all sides of the political spectrum, that accounts too much for this idea of property. But property is just one kind of our demonstrated interests. But we defend all kinds of demonstrated interests. Well, those obtained interests are, personal property, what's called several interests. These things an individual has a monopoly of control over, your physical property and things we can touch and feel. You have shareholder interests, things that you and I have agreed upon so that we each obtain benefit from it, and these are called fractional interests. Title interests, like these are brands and trademarks, prohibitions on, etc. Things we have a fragmentary interest in that are abstract, and artificial interests, things like letters of marks, patents, copyrights, and grants of license. So we can go from the very physical, material things that we have complete control over to things we have fractional control over, things we have permissive control over, and things we have privileged control over. And lastly, we have common interests. We tend not to think about common interests. One of the reasons I got into doing what I'm doing is that Friedrich Hayek wrote this book called A Road to Serfdom, and in his Nobel speeches, he talked about the use of knowledge in society, and he was talking about how knowledge and skill and habits and behavior and norms and traditions and means of decidability were assets that belonged to a people, and that interfering with those assets was actually theft. Was a theft on a grander scale, because while it's not physical and forceful, you're actually stealing from what makes people be able to cooperate together. So what I've tried to do is invert this awareness to be more conscious of our common interests that we unconsciously depend upon, just as I want everybody to be more conscious of our metaphysics, our group strategies that we depend upon. Because these things turn out to be what makes our extraordinary returns turn into multipliers, because we can cooperate at an increasingly trustworthy, more reliable, more predictable scales with larger numbers of us over larger periods of time, producing more complex means of production. So those common interests, those commons, what we would think of community property, is those objects into which we've invested mostly foregone opportunities. In other words, we buy common interests by not doing bad. We build common interests by not doing bad as much as we do it by doing good. So the most common, or the obvious one, is the informational commons, which is knowledge and information by which we make decisions, apply our skills, work together, understand this world. So every change in informational commons, whether you're creating a falsehood in it, creating a lie, creating a misinformation or disinformation, what you're doing is you're stealing from people's ability to cooperate at scale, performing high trust at lowest cost with the greatest returns. So the same thing is for our normative institutions, our norms, habits, manners, ethics, and morals. This informal institutional property is almost impossible to qualify in price, and the costs are subjective and consist largely of foregone opportunities, meaning we forego an opportunity for personal gain in order to pay the tax of buying interest into the commons. You can buy interest into constructive commons, or you can buy interest into destructive commons. You can provide information into and behavior into a system of commons production, or you can impose costs and destroy those commons upon which we depend. We have formal institutions, procedural institutions, religion, education, banking, treasury, government, law, and courts. So where we have metaphysical commons and informational commons we may not even be aware of, but we depend on. We have normative institutional commons that include our, everything that we, all our habits, ethics, morals, traditions, etc. We have formal commons, which are institutional commons, which are things that we use for the cooperation and intergenerational transfer of all of these things, the institutions of cultural production. We have formal physical commons, like our territory, our waterways, our parks, our buildings, our improvements, and our infrastructure. We have monumental commons and arts and artifacts. Monuments claim territory. That's what they mean. This is ours. They demonstrate wealth, and they provide one of the longest, most invariable normative and economic returns that any culture can construct as a demonstration of conspicuous wealth, and as such, conspicuous excellence. Hence why competing monuments represent an invasion. In other words, temples, churches, museums, sculptures being the most obvious examples of cultural claim or conquest. So when a group puts up a temple or a monument, they're claiming the territory, and they're claiming the right to normative norms, habits, and traditions, knowledge and information, and informal and formal institutions. That's why these people tear down monuments, and that's why people colonize by putting up temples. We have common opportunity interest, which is the the least understood and the probably most important. So when people come together in proximity and suppress imposition of costs upon the interests of others through the incremental evolution of the law, basically reciprocity, they decrease the time and effort required to produce voluntary association, cooperation, exchange. In other words, the primary value of coming together is to decrease the cost of the opportunity for cooperation. As such, polities decrease opportunity cost and generate new opportunities. This increases our velocity of cooperation. That's why density doesn't produce a linear, but an extra 20% for every doubling, extra 25%. So every time you double density, you get 25% extra more than you had before. This is why, of course, cities, our markets, are incredibly productive versus very less populated areas. So it's pretty obvious bit of math. Unfortunately, we get 25% more bads, just like we get 25% more goods. So it isn't an infinitely good problem. In other words, there are some maximums at which point you have to say to yourself, okay, our polity's too large, our city's too large, whatever, we need to break it into fragments, because the opportunity for malfeasance is increased to the point where the institutions can no longer capture it. So in any event, back to my point here, when people come together and suppress impositions, they decrease the time and effort to reproduce voluntary association, cooperation, and exchange. And as such, polities decrease opportunity costs and generate opportunities. But these opportunities are unhomesteaded. In other words, an opportunity that is created by our proximity isn't a cost you bore in directly. So opportunities are free to be had. Anyone can seize them. And so this is what happens when we bring people together, create markets, create trade, is that you're decreasing the cost of opportunity and you're concentrating the opportunities that we can seize, and those opportunities are available for seizure. So this is an important concept, is that polities create opportunities, but opportunities have to be converted into a demonstrated interest. So we create the opportunities by foregoing opportunity of seizure of opportunities at other people's cost, and we create a market for the seizure of opportunities by voluntary cooperation. So as such, the proximity of people and the institution of reciprocity under law produce a commons of opportunities that we seize, we homestead. What's what means first use. Homesteading means the first use by competition. So what we also do is we create this virtuous cycle of competition by not seizing opportunities, by forcing us into markets for cooperation, and then seizing the opportunities we've created by not seizing opportunities. In other words, seizing the good opportunities for productive voluntary cooperation by not seizing the opportunities for personal consumption at other people's expense. As such, no one can claim an interest in an opportunity without conducting an exchange by which to seize it. In other words, you have to demonstrate a cost, whether a foregone opportunity or a material cost, in an investment in order to obtain an interest. This is the formal logic of cooperation at any scale. So hopefully I've got that message across. This is one of the core principles. If you understand demonstrated interests and the basic economics of cooperation that I've just given out, in other words, how people come together and time is used. If you understand reciprocity and the terms of reciprocity, if you understand rational choice, and if you understand testimony, then you understand pretty much the formal logic of human behavior. There's nothing else to it. So if you want to consider people's behavior, take that list of natural interests, obtained interests, and common interests, and say, okay, what is the person trying to do? You can describe all behavior by that list of interests. You can say this person is trying to get this interest honestly and reciprocally, or dishonestly and irreciprocally. And that's it. Really, all human behavior can be reduced to that. All right, I'm Kurt Doolittle for the Proprietarian Institute of Natural Law. This is one of our core pieces. You might have to listen to it a couple times. Thank you very much. I hope you're enjoying the journey.